Welcome to the launch of Melinda's opus. I won't call it magnum opus because the best is yet to come. Counterrevolution. Right here, it's quite a tome. Over the last few weeks, I've had colleagues from Bangalore to Zurich tell me about how much Melinda's work has meant to them, and have learned of how highly her work is regarded from everyone from assistant professors to, as I learned yesterday, vice chancellors of major universities. I want to thank Erica McCown from the CAS and the CAS media team for recording this event so that these many constituencies, collectively known as Quinslebonians, as Cooperheads, can feed their enthusiasm. I also want to thank Pema Chodin and Maria Mendoza from the RSSS administrative team for their many efforts to make this event happen. They were here at 5 p.m. today. And actually, a colleague of mine yesterday, when I was telling her about lunch, she said, yeah, that's been well publicized. So that's all thanks to their efforts. And finally, to thank all of you for coming in this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aditya Balasubramanian, and I work in the School of History upstairs on the 5th floor. This event is going to be recorded, and so I'll also ask for those of you, when you ask questions, that I'll be coming around with a mic, so speak into the mic. That's maybe not for us, but for the world. Global responsibility and all that. I'd also like to ask you to switch off your phones or put them on silent. Nobody wants to be that person. Okay. So I want to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, whose sovereignty was never ceded, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to anyone who's of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background here with us this evening. And in the context of settler colonialism and its lingering effects, I also want to acknowledge and condemn the ongoing devastation of Gaza by the Israeli state, and draw attention to the Reimagining Palestine series of webinars that's been put together by our wonderful colleagues at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, led by Karima Lashir, which is work that has been important, I think, in producing counter-narratives to the Murdoch press. This evening's event is the flagship, event of ANU's newly founded Capitalism Studies Network, which was co-created by myself, Melinda, and Will Bateman, and Konstantina Zuvala from the College of Law earlier in 2024. The aim of this group is to bring together various scholars from across the university to study dimensions of capitalism, political, historical, legal, social, environmental, and what have you, and also to put us in conversation with scholars overseas, and to try to cultivate an encouraging environment for students from undergraduate to HDR, of which we'll be doing more events in the future. We provide a platform for sharing work in progress, hosting seminars, shaping and sharing curriculum, and collaborating on scholarships and grant applications. Our members have extensive connections with international scholars working in the new studies of capitalism, as well as a special interest in research being produced in the Asia-Pacific region that we call home. And we welcome affiliation from all of you and from various constituencies in other parts of Australia, so you can head to csn.anu.au for more info. We're holding kind of seminars, panels, book launches, public talks, and conferences. Our next event, for those of you who are interested, is also supported by the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies in the School of History, is a webinar called Before Islamic Finance, Muslim Banking in South Asia and the World, 1880 to 1975, featuring Michael O'Sullivan from UNC Chapel Hill, and you can find a way to kind of sign up for that on our website. It is my great honor to introduce this session on Counterrevolution. This is a significant book and represents the best of what we do here at ANU. It's already caused a flurry in North America and is the subject of an ongoing forum in the venerable and very exciting Law and Political Economy blog based out of Yale Law School, featuring leading academics. It is also a testament to the value of interdisciplinary research. And I think it's instructive in terms of helping us understand not only the American, but also kind of global increase in inequality over the last 50 years. I want to first introduce our speakers. So Melinda Cooper, for those of you who don't know her, needs no introduction, but I will do so anyway, is professor of sociology at ANU and the author of 3 highly acclaimed monographs. Of course, Life as Surplus, but also, I suppose, world-famous Family Values Between Neoliberalism and the New Social Conservatism. Ben Spies-Butcher is Associate Professor of Economy and Society at Macquarie, co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab, or UBI Lab, and the author of Politics, Inequality, and the Australian Welfare State After Liberalisation, and I work upstairs. The format of our session this evening is as follows. First, Melinda will introduce us to Counterrevolution. Ben and I will subsequently offer brief comments and questions about the book. And after Melinda's response, we'll open out to a general Q&A. Please join us afterwards for drinks and canapes in the RSSS lobby. And I'm told that the caterer this evening is very good, and that the philosophers were very satisfied because they catered the Passmore lectures. And if the philosophers are satisfied, then who are we? So do join us afterwards to raise a glass to our colleague. All right.
So thank you, Adi. I'm going to jump straight in. My book, Counterrevolution, is a continuation of the work that I and others have been pursuing into the history of American neoliberalism over the last few years. What is new in the book is the specific focus on the fiscal and monetary dimensions of neoliberalism, a focus that I think has become unavoidable for anyone seeking to imagine an alternative. It seems that however far these alternatives go, it is always at this very technical and seemingly neutral level of budgetary politics that they get blocked. Another world is simply not affordable. So I would describe the book as a critical inquiry that aspires to enable real alternatives, political as well as technical. With its focus on public finance, the book homes in onto 2 currents within the neoliberal tradition that have received relatively little attention in the literature. We know a lot about Chicago and Austrian school neoliberalism, Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek. We know much less about Virginia school neoliberalism and supply-side economics. Yet these are the 2 schools of thought that most dramatically influenced the tax and spending principles of American government from the late 1970s onwards. In passing, I'd argue that through policy dissemination, they've had a similar impact in Australia. Interestingly, these two schools saw themselves as rivals and often espoused radically different policy positions. To simplify the story a little, Virginia school neoliberalism is all about austerity. Its founding father, the political economist James McGill Buchanan, saw budget deficits almost as a moral failure. Supply-side neoliberalism is all about extravagance. It is agnostic about deficit spending and public debt finance, though not at all agnostic about how public money is spent and who or what it gets spent on. To understand neoliberal public finance, we need to explain how these 2 schools, despite their differences, converged around the imperative to rein in the redistributive and egalitarian uses of public spending. The book seeks to understand the paradox of austerity in the midst of plenty. My basic argument is that neoliberalism imposes a selective rule of austerity on wage earners and those dependent on the social wage, while at the same time ushering in a regime of radical spending and monetary extravagance for financial asset owners. Wage earners can only escape austerity if they borrow their way into the financial asset economy via property investment or stocks. We tend to see only the austerity side of the equation. hence the illusion that this is all about the retreat or retrenchment of the state. But it's very hard to explain the extreme wealth concentration that has occurred in recent decades if we don't also understand the multiple ways in which financial wealth is actively subsidized and inflated by the state and central bank. My book seeks to convey the practical as well as intellectual importance of Virginia School neoliberalism in shaping the mechanisms of budgetary austerity in the late 20th century. The political economist and constitutional philosopher James McGill Buchanan is known as the father of Virginia School neoliberalism, as well as the much broader church of public choice economics. He is not generally known as a policy practitioner. Yet Buchanan was actively involved in the first stirrings of the California tax revolt under Governor Ronald Reagan. And one of Buchanan's students drew on his thinking to design the local tax and spending limits that were enacted across the country in the 1980s. Buchanan was also the intellectual progenitor of the campaign for a federal balanced budget amendment, an idea he borrowed from the segregationist Southern Democrat Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia. More generally, it can be argued that Virginia School neoliberalism has left a long shadow in the now familiar spectacles of Republican debt ceiling showdowns, the routine abuse of the Senate filibuster, and threatened defaults on U.S. sovereign debt. In her 2017 study of Buchanan, Democracy in Chains, the historian Nancy McLean posits an elective affinity between Buchanan and Senator John C. Calhoun, the infamous philosopher of Southern secession. In contrast to McLean, I see Buchanan as more directly indebted to the post-Civil War project of the Southern Democrat Redeemers, who sought to dismantle the proto-welfare state of Black Reconstruction. Buchanan was a philosopher of fiscal rather than territorial secession. It's important to understand, for instance, that the mechanisms Buchanan helped build into the tax and spending ballots of the 1970s were near replicas of the devices invented by Redeemer Democrats in the wake of the Civil War. During this period, Southern states reformed their constitutions to limit property taxes, with the aim of rolling back the minimal welfare rights gained by Blacks and impoverished whites during this period. Most prominently, access to free public schools. These reforms included limits on the rate of taxation, spending caps, and supermajority votes, all of which were key elements of Buchanan's political philosophy and familiar to us now as part of the 1970s tax revolt. Buchanan himself described his project as a method of internal exit without secession, a kind of secession by other fiscal or budgetary means. The tax revolt of the 1970s erupted when white homeowners became concerned about the growing portion of their tax dollars being spent on inner-city Blacks and migrants. The fear was that white heads of household were being robbed of their hard-earned wealth to fund an increasingly militant public sector dominated by women and racial minorities. Various southern counties tried to literally secede from the greater Los Angeles area. A much simpler method was to impose constitutional shackles on the tax and spending powers of local government. This was what the tax revolt succeeded in doing across the United States. One predictable effect of tax and spending limits, which Buchanan embraced, was a shift from income and property taxes to regressive consumption taxes, which weigh most heavily on the poor. Across the United States, a growing proportion of local sales levies now take the form of invisible taxes such as user fees and fines. My book moves forward from the tax revolt of the 1970s to the urban politics of the 2010s, using Ferguson, Missouri as a case study in the long-term impact of tax and spending limits on urban politics. After the death of Michael Brown at the hands of police in 2014, the public interest law firm Arch City Defenders published a study investigating the widespread use of fees and fines in the St. Louis area. It found that local police had become an arm of local government finance. When counties had to make up for funding shortfalls, they could generate a mass of fines virtually at will by citing arcane municipal violations, ranging from uncut grass to loitering. The police then became the enforcers of those fines and tax collectors of last resort. Recognizing user fees and fines as invisible forms of taxation helps clarify something about the anti-tax message of Virginia School neoliberalism. This is not ultimately an argument against taxation, so much as a plea for a more regressive tax system, one that blurs the boundaries between taxation and punishment for the very poor. In contrast to local and state tax and expenditure limits, the long campaign to enact a federal balanced budget amendment, in which Buchanan also played a key role, is often dismissed as a failure. Nevertheless, a sizable proportion of the Republican Party remains doggedly attached to the campaign, and they have become adept at brandishing the mere threat of congressional obstruction to force budget balance on their opponents. The balanced budget rule is enforced without having been enacted, or at least it is enforced in the selective way that Republicans always wanted, as a means of limiting the space for any kind of public spending that might redistribute social wealth. The battle was won in the 1990s when New Democrat President Bill Clinton surrendered to the blackmail of Gingrich Republicans and abandoned his initial spending ambitions in favor of budget surpluses. The ensuing bipartisan consensus has made it increasingly difficult to raise direct or discretionary spending, leaving tax subsidies as the only viable arena for fiscal initiatives. Budget cuts have followed the path of least resistance, and as if by magic, have resurrected the punitive, carceral, racially targeted welfare rules preferred by Southern Democrats in the Jim Crow era. When compared to Virginia School neoliberals, supply-side economists were considerably less naive about the workings of government budgets. They were always closely involved in bond markets, so they had the same pragmatic understanding of government debt and deficit spending as bond traders. For the same reason, however, they were also very hawkish about any spending that might erode the value of bonds through inflation. It was not so much the amount of debt issued by governments as the type of spending it financed that they were concerned about. It is now well understood that the adoption of floating exchange rates under Nixon eventually led to a new regime of dollar hegemony, under which the United States could run perpetual deficits while still finding willing buyers in global debt markets. The supply-side economist Robert Mundell was among the first to appreciate this. Mundell foresaw that with the end of dollar-gold convertibility and the integration of world financial markets, the US could escape the limits that weighed on its public spending capabilities so long as it could persuade foreign central banks to purchase US government debt. However, Mundell also understood that the price to pay for this privilege was a permanent war against consumer price inflation. A permanent war against consumer price inflation, which debased the value of US Treasury debt and repelled bond investors. In the militant 1970s, Treasury officials were convinced that the primary drivers of inflation were an overly powerful trade union movement and wider social movement pressure for increased public spending. These needed to be crushed if the US was to assert its global dollar hegemony on new terms. The paradox was this. By adopting floating exchange rates and selling its debt on global financial markets, the US was now able to issue debt without limit, unrestrained by the gold standard. But freedom to issue debt is not the same thing as freedom to spend. The supply-side economist Paul Craig Roberts put this nicely when he said there are two kinds of deficits, inflationary and non-inflationary, bad and good. The distinction is all important because it allows supply-siders to sanction an extraordinarily generous public spending agenda as long as it's in the service of financial asset holders. While bondholders are allergic to wage and consumer price inflation, they have no problems at all with the inflation of asset prices. In this way, the supply-siders ended up enacting a rule of selective austerity in the context of plenty, and found a pragmatic point of convergence with Virginia School neoliberals. Anything that might drive up the formal and social wage, such as more generous public services or welfare, is off the table. Public spending that serves a disciplinary function, defense, policing, or correctional services, is admissible, although increasingly it too is subject to the rule of austerity and uses pay. By contrast, supply-side economics places no boundaries at all on the use of tax preferences to subsidize investment gains in financial assets such as stocks or housing. Supply-siders call these tax incentives, but public finance specialists commonly refer to them as tax expenditures because they are functionally equivalent to government spending and have the same effect in terms of government accounts. They create deficits too. When it comes to this kind of spending, supply-side economists reject the rule of austerity. There is no need to limit the deployment of tax subsidies on behalf of financial asset holders, they argue, because this kind of government spending is not inflationary, or rather, it produces the good kind of inflation, the inflation of asset-based wealth, rather than the inflation of wages or public services. The supply-siders were closely involved in the elite business revolt of the 1970s, which saw major trade associations rebel against the terms of the New Deal consensus. At the time, industrialists and financial asset holders were barely keeping their heads above water. Profits were stagnant or falling, with management struggling to hold its own against labor unions. And by the end of the decade, equities and bonds were yielding paltry, sometimes negative returns. The supply-side answer? A massive government spending campaign to subsidize returns to capital. That is to say, the adoption of tax incentives to capital income of all kinds. Central to the supply-side vision of economic renewal are what are known as capital gains. A capital gain is the tax accounting term for asset price appreciation. It refers to any increase in the value of an asset that can be attributed to processes of market valuation, rather than capacity to produce commodities. Cuts to the capital gains tax were at the heart of the supply-side agenda from the very beginning. Although all kinds of industrial interests participated in the business-led revolt of the 1970s, in the end, it was the holders of financial assets who triumphed. The long-term effect of this tax agenda has been to privilege those forms of economic activity that benefit most from capital gains preferences, notably general partners in private investment funds, such as private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital, and of course, real estate investors. A near-bankrupt New York City in the 1970s was the first urban laboratory for supply-side economics, and Donald Trump owes his extraordinary personal ascent to the supply-side movement as much as he does to his father. In my previous book, Family Values, I argued that any regime of value based on capital gains is bound to elevate the importance of family wealth in shaping individual life chances and class status. The supply-siders were very much aware of this from the start. They pushed for cuts to the estate and gift tax alongside tax preferences for capital gains. Given the relationship between capital gains and inheritance, it was almost inevitable then that we would arrive at the present conjuncture with its frightening concentrations of wealth. I say almost inevitable because the real accelerator was the shift in monetary policy of the late 1990s, when the once hawkish Alan Greenspan pivoted to low interest rates, and the Fed promised to do all in its power to inflate the value of financial assets. The shift towards monetary accommodation reached its climax with the post-GFC and coronavirus rounds of quantitative easing. The irony here was that the Fed was now openly engaging in a practice that was the founding taboo of neoliberal monetary policy, namely money printing or the creation of money to purchase government securities. The effect was to drive down the cost of public spending to zero. Yet far from representing a turn away from neoliberal monetary logic, I argue, this was simply the acknowledgement that government spending itself had become so indulgent toward asset holders and so inimical to wage earners and welfare beneficiaries that central bank money creation no longer represented the threat it once had. By driving down the cost of credit to almost zero, QE supercharged the flood of investment money into financial assets and drove up their value. What looked like a slippery slope to the hyperinflation of wages in the 1970s was now openly embraced as a policy pathway to the hyperinflation of financial assets. While the distributional consequences of the neoliberal counter-revolution have been closely tracked by scholars such as Thomas Piketty, less appreciated is that this same era has witnessed a shift in the organizational forms of capitalism. The publicly traded, vertically integrated corporation that once dominated the landscape of mid-20th century capitalism is no longer the institution it once was. Private, founder-controlled, or family-owned corporations have assumed a new prominence in American capitalism. New tech firms are avoiding the lure of public markets for as long as they can, growing to massive so-called unicorn size before they launch an IPO. And even when these unicorns do go public, they are finding new and ingenious ways to install founder control behind the facade of the shareholder-owned corporation. The organizational priorities of corporations are increasingly dictated by private, unincorporated entities, such as private equity firms, hedge funds, and venture capital, with their ruthless disregard for anything but capital gains in share prices. Among the most aggressive of these private players are so-called family offices, kin-based wealth investment funds that have multiplied as a result of the decade-long surge in wealth concentration. To mention just one salient example, Elon Musk is now the sole shareholder of Twitter, or X, which he purchased with the help of his family office. He is now seeking to gain sole control of the publicly traded Tesla through extension of his voting rights. Founder control, whether by outright private ownership or dual-class share structures, is increasingly the norm in the new tech sector. And this signifies the rise of a patrimonial elite, which can wield its power intergenerationally by bequeathing office as well as wealth to its descendants. It seems to me that this shift is key to understanding not just the economic, but the political locus of power in contemporary capitalism. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Citizen United decision of 2010, it was private unlisted companies and their founders, not listed corporations that ended up exploiting the new rules around political donation. Hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer, in particular, seems to have perfectly understood the importance of private investor money in funding the long war of position from the right. Mercer played a key role in financing the legal challenge behind Citizens United and was among the first to take advantage of its new rules to funnel money to the anti-establishment right. Mercer stands at the intersection of an older lineage of private business donors, such as the Koch brothers and the DeVos family, and a more recent constellation of Republican right figures, such as Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, and Elon Musk, each of whom made their fortunes in the world of founder-controlled startups or private investment. As much political entrepreneurs as they are financiers, these figures have resurrected the old libertarian critique of corporate managerialism to cast themselves as representatives of a more heroic anti-woke capitalism, oriented to the high-tech future as much as it is to an imagined feudal past. It has become fashionable to take tech billionaires at their word and describe this as a leap into the feudal past that is at the same time a leap beyond capitalism, perhaps into something worse, but in any event, beyond capitalism. I'm not convinced by the techno-feudalism thesis, for the simple reason that the dynasts of our time enjoy a level of organized public support that medieval lords could only dream of. We live in an age of paradoxes where private family wealth soars in value with the full collusion of the world's most powerful fiscal and monetary authorities. In the meantime, wages and welfare spending are relentlessly suppressed as a mortal threat to the value of financial assets. It is the paradoxical coexistence of extravagant government spending alongside chronic austerity that I seek to unravel in this book. Thank you.
So first of all, an enormous thank you, Melinda, for inviting me in to talk about this wonderful book. There are a few books where first of all, it is very engaging. Anyone who's read her other work knows this, but it's an extremely engaging book to read for something that is about fiscal and monetary politics. Even for something that isn't about fiscal and monetary politics. As I was reading it, it was over and over again, I just went, I wish I had read this before I'd written all those other things I've written about this, because it is so insightful and so good at pulling very disparate threads together. Particularly, I think, for debates around neoliberalism, where often it's very hard to put your finger on exactly what neoliberalism is, or when you do put your finger on it, it seems to only match about half the things that you think it's supposed to match and not really any of the others. This is a very careful way of threading needles that genuinely shows how intellectuals, sets of ideas, policymakers and politicians wove this together. And you got a sense of that just from the presentation you gave there, of exactly how she does that. It is remarkable. The other two bits that I want to unpack a little bit more, which I think are really valuable, is there is a theory of class here that is much deeper than I think the theories of class which are currently animating, especially the United States, but I think debates elsewhere in Australia as well. One that talks about the transformation of the capitalist class and the transformation of the working class as part of this project, as a project that tries to remake capital in the patrimonial image, and does so through changes in particularly tax law, but also other legal instruments as well. And that is associated with a shift in a self-understanding or an appeal to elements of especially the blue-collar male white working class as self-made independent contractors that often don't have college degrees, and therefore the conflation of college education with class becomes remarkably complicated, where you've got people complicated in both that there are different class positions that are being homogenized in this idea, but also that often there are very different class positions that are being presented in each of these educational categories. And I think thinking that through is really helpful in the United States. I think it's also really helpful here, where when you think about some of the biggest growth in the workforce in Australia is in jobs that I think most people would reasonably define as associated with the working class, but which require degrees, you know, nurses, teachers, and so forth. And that's associated with this specific history in the United States to a political tactic that proves very successful of conservatives appealing to those blue-collar white men in the private sector against feminized workforces and people of colour who are employed in the public sector in order to make a case against tax and against the fiscal powers of the state. And that is a remarkably effective political strategy. So the interweaving of the intellectual, the economic, and the political, I think, is really, really helpful. And the next bit is just how useful it is, as you just got a bit of a sense of unpacking what these fiscal and monetary tools are. So what are the tricks of the trade that have led to this massive upward redistribution of wealth, of people's lives being made so much less secure? And that shift of using things, much of this, I imagine, as you were listening to it, certainly as I was reading it, you're going, just so much of this resonates with our experience here. It reads to Australian eyes. You go, you mean there are governments that say they can't do anything at all because their hands are constrained by these fiscal constraints that seem to miraculously appear and disappear in ways that no one can quite understand. That there are a series of concessions that most normal people don't understand that seem to allow people investment strategies over basic goods like houses that see asset prices inflate in order to transfer wealth while wages don't. And that all of that seems to be enforced by a paradoxical monetary policy that in one moment turns on the taps full bore and then spends, as we're currently seeing with the Reserve Bank, a lot of time reasserting that those rules that were in place before never went away and need to be enforced even more strictly now than they ever did before. So all of those things, I think, come through really usefully, and I think alert us to where we need to spend attention. If we want to challenge this, we do need to get our heads around how monetary policy works, unfortunately. We do need to understand these debates about capital gains tax and negative gearing, about why Australia doesn't have an inheritance tax. We did before this era began, we don't now. Because those things are at the heart of the struggles that are going on over the economy. And this is the last bit that I'll hand over. There are also parts of this story that are quite different in Australia. And the story, the conflation of, you might say, post-segregation politics in the United States, which conflates in this very dangerous and powerful way a highly gendered, highly racialized imaginary with this fiscal and monetary politics and this reconfiguration of class, you can completely see elements of that today. You can see it in the coalition's instant asset write-off for tradies, right? You can see it in changes to industrial relations law that turned people who were on building sites into private contractors when they were previously employed. You can see it in the Northern Territory intervention and the residualisation and demonisation of people on welfare by constructing these racialised categories and using these extreme powers. But there are lots of areas where it doesn't play in quite the same way, and I think there may be some hopeful lessons in that too. And particularly the politics around gender in the 1980s is very different in Australia. We're expanding payments. We're making them less conditional. We're expanding public services, at least to some extent, for quite some time. And that is also associated with political strategy, but a political strategy not of the recent election and the Teals, but of a much earlier strategy of feminists in Australia to convince the Labor Party, a very, just as brittle a tactician machine then as it is now, that they could win elections by appealing to women voters. And that strategy was associated with a series of different tactics that haven't completely worked by any means, but certainly I think have avoided some of those key, really dangerous and awful parts of what we saw in the US. And one other thing which I think, as I was reading the appeals of Ronald Reagan and other conservatives to private sector, white, blue-collar male workers, in the construction sector especially, and making this highly racialised, gendered assault on the state, and thinking about what was going on not very long ago, just before that in Australia, which was radically different, when the BLF were organising almost exactly the same group of workers to ban, not only in favour of environmental goals, but to put a ban on Sydney University, to set up the Women's Studies program, to put a ban on Macquarie University for sacking a gay lecturer, that there was something that was built into the solidarities of the Australian union movement that proved enormously protective at that moment because of strong communist-led unions that were able to forge solidarities that did confront some of these most dangerous elements and did at least a little bit act as some counter force to those. That's obviously, that hasn't insulated us completely. But I think it has offered us some protections, and more usefully, it offers us some lessons about the kinds of solidarities that are required to be able to fight this fiscal and monetary politics. Technical as it is, in the end, the politics come down to some pretty old adages of building solidarities and being able to translate those solidarities into forms of statecraft, into electoral strategies, and into real movements on the street that, in my reading, were the only way that we might have some glimmers of hope of being able to pull this back. And with that, I'm going to... Oh, yeah. And so I suppose the couple of questions that came out of that... sorry, thank you very much. Yeah, but it might be useful for other people. So, which inform what I've just said, hopefully, a little bit, is how do these ideas travel once they leave the United States? Because they clearly do, and they clearly reframe everywhere, but they travel in different ways. We don't have a debt ceiling here. Everyone's heard a lot about the CPRS, but there was one other time the Greens voted with the Liberals, it was to get rid of a debt ceiling. Thank God. But we do have many of the other same rules, but we don't have exactly the same segregationist racialised politics. So how do they travel? And the other is, I think this book really convincingly tells us how parts of conservative anti-democratic politics use fiscal and monetary rules to subvert democracy and to upwardly distribute wealth. But as you say, the title of the book, it's Counterrevolution. They're acting against the strength of democratic movements. So if we think about this not so much as their triumph, but as their defensive manoeuvre, do we learn something about how we made them defensive in the first place?
Yes. One kind of big reframing that I try to do in the background is to say that the way I see the neoliberal counter-revolution, and I do configure it as a counter-revolution, is not against Keynesianism per se, and I think you get into all kinds of political and analytical problems when you do see that. I think what occurred in the 1970s was an imminent critique of Keynesianism, which was expanding the fiscal and monetary tools of Keynesianism beyond the limits which Keynesianism was prepared to accept, and beyond the limits that made Keynesianism acceptable to much of the corporate class. So I think the 1970s is this very interesting period where from the left, the labor movement and the broader social movements, and I'm talking about land rights movements, feminist movements, gay and lesbian liberation, and beyond, I think you're getting a push to I guess, manipulate the fiscal levers of the state from below so that more and more constituencies are being included in the promise of the Keynesian social wage. And at a certain point, this does produce wage push inflation or social wage push inflation. I'm not someone who tries to deny that small moment of agency for the left. And I think what neoliberalism was is a backlash against this critique of Keynesianism from the left. So not a backlash against Keynesianism per se. And the reason why I find the period of the 1970s so interesting is I do think we see a lot of very interesting social experimentation that had real monetary and fiscal effects. Wage push inflation was a victory for a short period of time, a partial victory. It meant that you had constituencies that were excluded from the Keynesian consensus. This was, after all, a gendered and racial consensus, as much in Australia as in the States, and that applies to migrants as well as Aboriginal workers. At a certain point, you're getting claims for land rights, for the extension of the dole. You're getting people who can go to university who couldn't in the past. This pushes up the social wage, and that's a victory. Neoliberalism was a backlash against that. So, of course, you can't go to the 1970s and repeat these strategies because everything we have, every institution has been contorted as a response to that, and a way of dealing with that, that challenge. But at least it's a kind of counterfactual that says, you know, small victories are possible and things can be moved. So yeah.
Right. Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be able to comment on this book in front of colleagues and friends. And I would say that this is social science as it's at its best and most provocative. And as we've heard, it leads with an urgency for our times. I should also say, as a historian, that I find it exceptionally attractive that there are about 160 pages of endnotes, and that forms. That forms a separate book of its own, really, including, Melinda's takes on Robert Brenner and this sort of thing, right? So, yeah, make sure to read the endnotes. So with that, yeah, absolutely. Save the best for last. No, so I guess my remarks will be a little bit more historical. So the 1970s, as we've talked about, spooked American conservatives, and it seemed in a sense, that the stability of the post-war era for conservatives was over. The so-called golden age, which of Western economies from 1945 to 1975 that Eric Hobsbawm talks about in The Age of Extremes, was over. No longer could the United States continue to run its current account deficit as it had been doing since 1945, or so it seemed at the time. Right? The country had inadequate reserves to maintain the dollar's convertibility to gold, which had guaranteed a fixed exchange rate system for the rest of the world. Tensions in the Middle East led the oil producers to embargo the United States and other allies of the Israeli state twice during the decade, leaving America's petroleum-dependent economy reeling in some senses. There was a declaration for a new international economic order by the Group of 77, and decolonization and feminist movements all over the world kind of asserted claims to a better and more equitable world. In the United States, over the previous decade, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, the civil rights movements, and gains by unionized labor had wrought profound changes that could not have been foreseen. More than before, African Americans and minorities were being integrated into the workforce, and their standards of living improved for the first time since emancipation. The social consensus around World War II had long-term effects in engendering solidarity among Americans. But the Vietnam War threatened to undermine much of it. And so in the eyes of free market economists and Republican politicians, ranging from Ronald Reagan to Harry Flood Baird, both senior and junior, to Jack Kump, social conflict and progressive movements were symbols of a malaise gripping American society. It had to be counteracted by providing incentives to asset holders who gave America the base of savings for so-called productive investments, defunding, again, so-called wasteful state programs, and not spending what was being collected as revenue or balancing, more than what was being collected as revenue or balancing budget. What that meant was pursuing policy that may not have been rhetorically explicit in its racist or classist dimensions, and indeed claimed to accrue to the hardworking and the independent. But in reality, it meant helping asset holders grow richer, incentivizing intergenerational capital accumulation via family businesses and trust, and punishing the poor and forcing them into increasingly casual forms of work, reducing opportunities for African Americans and minorities. It meant high interest rates for borrowers in the 1970s to allow the United States to be a destination for savers, and it meant accommodative monetary policy to preserve the value of their assets and the expansion of Fed balance sheets during the 2010s. If you invested your money in the S&P 500 in 2012, by 2022, you would have reaped a return of 272%. That's pretty good. The Republicans took over from the Southern Democrats in the post-civil rights era and imprinted their control in formerly slaveholding America, aided and abetted by the University of Virginia economist, later George Mason, economist James Buchanan and his ideas in public choice theory. And yet the differences between major parties was not always so stark. Political realignment after the collapse of unionized labor and the decline of Fordism, among other things, created a very different Democratic Party than before. It was Bill Clinton, after all, who was the first president to actually balance the national budget and cut aid for families with dependent children, replacing it with temporary assistance for needy families and the interestingly titled Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. Effectively, this pushed people into low-wage jobs and cut the safety net to 2 months. It may have helped stave off Newt Gingrich's Contract for America, but at what cost? Here are a few of several kind of contributions and provocations that I believe this book offers. The first is a compelling way to study economic thought and practice, in practice, in a way that doesn't cut corners. Melinda re-embeds analysis of the ideas of economists in political and social context. Unfortunately, much literature in the history of economics, and I say that as somebody who kind of comes from that tradition, continues to draw a straight line from the brains of elite theorists into policy. Instead, Melinda's careful archival research demonstrates ties between the likes of figures like Buchanan and policymakers and shows their racist and often sexist attitude, including, for example, the emasculation of the male worker. The economic smokescreen over socially and racially regressive politics can help us understand how the far right has managed to infiltrate the right-wing mainstream across the world, I think. Another one of the features of Melinda's work that is so attractive is that it is rigorous both in terms of analyzing class as an objective and subjective phenomenon, right? And something that Ben kind of alluded to. In other words, both imagined class identities, such as the ones that are assumed by Tea Party supporters and far-right movements globally, as well as objective considerations of class, like statistics about asset appreciation for shareholders that are brought into the book. The book, and here I would slightly differ from Ben, the book further shows how neoliberals are not necessarily anti-democratic, even if they are against the spirit of democracy in its kind of ideal form, right? Rather, they can be pretty skillful at using the mechanisms of democracy to promote their ends. So by pushing successfully for referendum to vote on Prop 13, which limited property taxation in California as part of the tax revolt, they were actually promoting the use of direct democracy, perversely, for their ends, right? Requiring a supermajority to pass legislation increasing state taxes was also construed as defending minority rights, which, if we think of, is actually consistent with republicanism in the definitional sense, right? And so critical histories of democratic practice like these, rather than simplistic normative use of the terminology, is a useful way forward, I think, for scholarship. And then kind of to reflect on this as a historian of political economy and of South Asia, I think this book invites research into parallel questions beyond the American context, to which Ben has so skillfully pointed out in the Australian context. How have developmental and welfare states been hijacked to capitalist and ethno-majoritarian interests? Where has counter-revolution possibly not worked, right? And as this is an event for a capitalism studies network, how significant is asset depreciation as a modality of capital accumulation and family-based holding paralleled in other parts of the world, as in the United States? I mean, I think about the Ambani wedding earlier this year and the rise of family capitalism, particularly in the Modi era, and I think that there's a sort of extraordinarily interesting parallel phenomenon there. We also have legislation, the Hindu undivided family, that provides tax incentives for basically for primogeniture, right? I want to conclude by raising three questions for Melinda. One of the things that is very compelling about your book is how you show that rhetorical conflations allow vast class inequalities to be papered over for the economically elite to appeal to non-elites. For example, the independent business owner or small business. I recall playing drinking games when I watched the debates, democratic debates. Every time someone says small business, take a sip, right? So they can be anybody from the Koch brothers to the owner of a mom and pop shop, right, to the independent blue collar contractor, in contradistinction to the large publicly listed CEO managed corporation and its workers, right? And it is exactly this rhetorical conflation that a figure like Donald Trump has used to widen his appeal. So do you think this is something that the right has actually been more skillful at doing than the left, and perhaps why? Perhaps these are conflations that the left can also make in creating solidarity between distinct interests. The next question I want to ask is about the role of intellectuals and experts in the story that you tell, particularly the Virginia School. Melinda points in a far more persuasive manner than does Nancy MacLean to the connection between James Buchanan and balanced budget initiatives in politics, tracing his role in drafting policy for Reagan as a part of a team when the latter was a California politician, and in Buchanan's congressional testimonies and such. But at the same time, Melinda points to the fact that efforts to introduce balanced budget legislation trace a longer history dating to the 1950s. So in that context, what does a figure like Buchanan do? What work does he do? Does every generation require a new intellectual to legitimate or dress up old wine in new bottles? And in other words, would you have seen these dynamics play out without him? Finally, at the end of the book, among other things, you speak of the revitalization of left politics. I'm wondering if you see this flow through to some extent to mainstream politics and policy in the United States, although of course there's much to convince us otherwise. Bernie Sanders would actually say that it has, as evidenced by the op-ed that he wrote in defense of President Biden after the latter's disastrous debate. I'm thinking specifically of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So the act seeks to raise revenue from prescription drug reform, to lower prices and rebates from price gougers, by imposing a selective 15% corporate minimum tax for companies with higher than $1 billion of financial statement income, increased tax enforcement, excise taxes on share buybacks, and a 2-year extension of the limitation on excess business losses. The act also spends this money on addressing energy security and climate change, continuing the expansion of the Affordable Care Act subsidies originally expanded during the COVID-era Rescue Plan Act, and adding low-income subsidies, vaccine coverage, and insulin subsidies, as well as increasing funding for the IRS to modernize and increase tax enforcement. So do we see the center of gravity shifting a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I can connect that question about class coalitions to what Ben said about the BLF in Australia as being an almost exact counterpart to what looks like the kind of instinctive conservatism of the construction worker unions in the States. And I certainly don't think that construction workers are fated to be reactionary. And I just think it's very interesting that they've kind of occupied that pivot position, at least in the United United States, where in the early 1970s, they were the most powerful trade unions and were widely blamed for wage push inflation. And yet the most powerful trade unions were constituted by construction workers who, for the most part, were also independent sole traders. So they were also small business owners, if you want to use that word. So it became very easy to lean on that part of their identity by playing up their differences or their different interests with the rest of the working class to then divide them. But the BLF is, the perfect counterexample, because you can see, the most left-wing, new left of the unions in Australia was the lowest of the low in the construction workforce. So I think, that remains an interesting case study, because you have the figure of the tradie is the kind of symbolic figure that does that work of imaginary populist class coalition on the right today. It's the kind of Liberal Party's working class. But within that figure of the tradie, there's all kinds of very distinct class positions. If you look closer, some people are actual labourers working for independent contractors who are business people who hire an entire workforce. So there are very different class positions amongst this group of people called tradies. And the lowest of the low, even though they're called independent traders, are in the same class position as, say, Uber drivers or cleaners who are independent contractors. So there's room there to create coalitions, and I think what the book shows is that the populist right in the United States put in a lot of work over decades and decades to create those coalitions, so they're not at all automatic. And in some sense, that's, hopeful. So the second question, old wine in new bottles, it's true, but that's not easy to dress up old wine in new bottles. Again, it was a lot of work. And in the 1950s, when the Southern Democrats wanted to enact a balanced budget amendment to stop Eisenhower Republicans, who they thought were too generous, who were too Keynesian, it just fell flat because they didn't have a constituency anymore. The political center had moved to a kind of business Keynesianism, and that included Republicans. So they had to spend many years fighting the new intellectual hegemony of neoclassical Keynesianism and the political constituency that had been built up by the New Deal coalition. And so Buchanan had to argue for, one, why his kind of peculiar recipe of balanced budgets and tax cuts was right for the given moment. He had to be able to persuade not just the political class, but a kind of wider popular class of people that this was right for them. The tax revolt played that role. But this happens over decades and decades. And the problem is that, so if you look at Buchanan's first attempt to resurrect the balanced budget amendment in the 1970s, the people who are signing on and speaking are all these kind of like 70 and 80-year-old Dixiecrats and Southern Democrats who are about to die. So there's also all this work to convert one part of the Republican Party to what had been classically conservative Southern Democrat politics. So yeah, I mean, intellectually, this looks like very light stuff that any kind of post-war Keynesian could have unpicked easily. But, political complexity and sophistication is not what gives economic ideas traction in the political sphere, as you would have noticed. So it was more about creating these solidarities, and they did that very well. The third question was, Biden. Yeah, I think it's clear that the Democrats have been pushed to the left by the Bernie Sanders movement. And in a sense, I mean, a lot of it looks kind of disappointing. You can see still the imprint of 40 years of neoliberalism, because a lot of their grand spending initiatives are in the form of tax concessions. But a lot of what they wanted to do at the beginning was more ambitious than that, and a lot of the people who had advisors embedded in government are very heterodox people. very interesting people. So, I mean, that was unimaginable under Obama, unimaginable. I mean, where I see less hope is that the Democrat Party seems to be very, have developed a symbiotic relationship with BlackRock and the big asset managers. So it seems to me that they're going down a pathway to kind of big public-private partnerships and that kind of thing. So, you know, where partisan politics goes in the future, I think depends on the extra parliamentary left, or extra, whatever you call the extra parliamentary left in the US, extra congressional left, yes. Yeah. Anyway, so should we open it up?
Yeah, let's open up for questions. We'll take about 15 minutes of this, and then we can get to the goodies that people like. So I'm just going to come around and circulate the mic. See over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew Podgers from the third floor. Can I challenge a couple of things you said by asking a little bit about implications for Australia? One is, of course, one of Buchanan's co-writers was Geoffrey Brennan from ANU. And I wonder whether your portrayal of Buchanan would actually be could be applied to Brennan. I would have thought it'd be very hard. And I wonder what Brennan might have said in response to what you said. And the second one was, the term neoliberal tends to be a pejorative term rather than a clear descriptive term. And when I think of some of the things in the 80s here, aspects of using markets was by the Hawke-Keating government also used for extending equity, I think in terms of HECS and the expansion of higher education associated with the revenues that were raised through that, or I think of superannuation. But they were neoliberal in terms of they're using markets, but are actually delivering quite positive things. I just wonder whether the story is a little bit more complicated when it comes to Australia.
Yeah, one about George Brennan. So he was a co-author on one of the texts that I think called The Power to Tax, which does seem to reference the tax revolt. I'm not sure how conscious Buchanan's Australian collaborators were about Buchanan's political connections in the US, or his personal political philosophy. The reason I think this is because I was in the archives, and where you get Buchanan speaking frankly is in his letters to Gordon Tullock, and not much else. I looked a little at the letters to Australians, including Chapman, who helped design HECS, and I don't see that Buchanan playing out there. And he was always very clear with Gordon Tullock that the Public Choice Society was to be a broad church, I guess purely intellectual endeavour that would bring in people of all political persuasions, and they were not going to share their own political personas in that domain. So that's what I would say. Having said that, I don't know Geoffrey Brennan's work all that well, so I can't say. But I certainly see them having this kind of double personality with other academic figures from around the world, and they collaborated a lot with people who were, definitely not on the hard right of the political spectrum. About the word neoliberalism being used as a pejorative, well, I mean, it's used in a lot of it has been used in a lot of languages in a pretty straightforward way for a long time. It's in English that it hasn't been used so much. But one of the first kind of common sense usages of the word was by New Democrats and the Democratic Leadership Council under Clinton, and they called themselves neoliberals. Perhaps with a slightly different valence, but I would call them third-way neoliberals. So I do think Clinton, Blair, and Paul Keating were neoliberals of a sort. Where they don't kind of fit in the kind of scholarly genealogy is a lot of that history will say you can trace kind of family trees going from the Mont Pelerin Society, and these people are, connected. Buchanan was a president of the Montpellerin society. You don't see that with Keating or Hawke or Clinton, of course, because they were not friendly with these people. And yet a lot of the policy ideas and proclivities are very similar. They're what Ben would call hybrids. So what I think they're trying to do is retain some of the social democratic, the expanded social democratic promise of the 1970s with the new social movements, and use market and especially consumer credit options, so consumer debt, as with HEX, to maintain that promise much longer, to help it survive much longer than it would have if it had always been straight austerity. So the expansion of consumer credit over that period is very much powered by the third way neoliberals. And that allows for a kind of new kind of quasi-social democratic consensus that operates not through direct public spending, but through the expansion of private consumer credit. And HEX is an excellent example of that, except in Australia you have this added detail that the consumer credit is managed through the state and the tax system, which I think is rather unique.
Okay, next. Yep.
Thanks, Melinda, for the great talk on the book. I wanted to ask a little bit about, I suppose, the politics of these reforms and maybe your thoughts on the politics in which you fight this. One thing that comes across in some sense is how there are a few aspects of these fiscal and monetary fights which are those big picture things like the big constitutional amendments around limiting deficit spending and this kind of stuff, but how a lot of it also seems to be through these kind of very small programs here, small program there, tax concession there, tax concession there, and you almost get, as opposed to maybe a view of the state as kind of this, or the state policy as this coherent program, you almost start to see the state as kind of this huge terrain on which little battles play out on every single one of these little concessions, which is very unsatisfying if you're, I guess, you're a programmatic sort of left-winger who wants to see the big thing get fixed all at once. And I guess, do you have any reflections on that kind of way in which these things are fought, line item by line item, and whether is that the left's response? Do we have to join in on that line item by line item fight and expand the social state and expand public provision through that kind of conflict, or is there a room for maybe the more programmatic politics?
I think there is room. Of course I'm going to think that, but it hasn't happened. And the only time in recent history that we've seen it happen is under kind of states of emergency, like COVID, when suddenly direct spending, very universal, not means-tested spending, suddenly becomes possible. And then since then it's been, let's erase that from memory, let's punish so everyone forgets that. And on the horizon there's, unfortunately, one of the drivers of the kind of Biden shift to the left has been this looming sense of a kind of changing security situation, where it's a kind of novel Cold War atmosphere that makes certain kinds of very technocratic spending limit look arcane and too much in the way. So you would hope that there are other ways of breaking through. I think that the only way is through a reinvigorated labour movement. I think that's the only way that would happen. But I also think because so much of the cost of living has expanded into housing, and the question of debt, so much of people's actual spending comes in the form of consumer credit now. It's questions around debt, around HEX repayments, around rent controls that will be similarly important. So any big breakthrough in any one of these areas, I think, would be a real victory. similar to the ones that the right suddenly got in the 1970s. Like the tax revolt, I think, was a breakthrough moment for the right. And then bang, 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 they were able to pass all these things that they've been kind of like designing in their dark rooms for 50 years or so. Yeah.
All right, so we've got 2 more questions. I've already taken them. So, and then you can continue at the reception with the aid of good food and drink to ask Melinda further questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Melinda. So I guess my question was something to do with the how of the way you write a book like this. I mean, when you get up and read from it, I mean, I'm just struck by how incredibly beautiful your style of narrating, like telling a story is. I mean, we talk about something like archival work as if it's a question of, putting on a cowl neck jumper and going off to a dusty old library somewhere and then just reading the facts. But there's obviously ways of reading. And so I guess I wanted to ask you about your sort of central challenge to, like, your positioning of neoliberalism as a form of backlash. Obviously theoretically through French post-structuralism, radical Italian theory, that's been a kind of a real move to actually say, look, resistance comes first and power is always reactive. I think in terms of economic sort of forms of study, something like, say, Gibbs and Graham's work is basically picking up on the performative turn, that we don't want to keep telling that story of capitalism as this sort of monstrous sovereign actor. And I guess what I'm wanting to ask you is there a kind of a strategic move in you challenging that image of neoliberalism as a sovereign actor in the way that it's spoken about by those who use it positively or pejoratively? Or was it something that just kind of blatantly stood out to you from the facts of your archival research? The idea that in some sense neoliberalism is a form of backlash rather than this.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. I mean, when you look at the archives, because it's very slow time across years, and you're kind of looking at someone's life you're looking at politics biographically, you get a sense of how much all of this is about strategy, and strategies that failed for years on end. So there's something helpful about that, even though these people ended up being victorious, and then probably victorious beyond their wildest dreams, or what they might even approve of. Like, I kind of feel like today's Republican Party, Buchanan might not approve of. So it reminds you of the fact of the importance of strategy. And I mean, the story is in some ways quite a dark one, so I'm not trying to. I do have a little history with Italian autonomism, and I do see the euphoria that you might have in what was happening in the 1960s and 1970s, but I think they maintain the euphoria way after they should, and that what's happening in the 80s and 90s and so on is really backlash. I mean, backlash with the social democratic concessions along the way, but it's still backlash. So it's not, to me, it's not satisfying to pretend otherwise. But if you can keep in mind, I mean, I open with the question of counterfactuals, like, could things have happened otherwise? And at the end, I'm like, could things happen otherwise now? It's all just all question marks, but I think if you keep counterfactuals open and strategic alternatives, that's enough, instead of just pretending everything's okay and good. Yeah.
Yeah. This kind of follows up from your response to this person here. I was thinking, as you were talking about the generational effects of asset inflation and how in Australia at the moment it's become more and more acute, well, housing basically. The cost of housing has become so inflated to a point where it does seem to be a genuine crisis. And just wondering about whether, because one of the effects I see emerging from that crisis is something akin to a birth strike. Yeah. The very steep decline, and it's, I think, steeper than most public policy people actually appreciate. The very steep decline in the fertility rate is such that for the organisation of the economy, this is going to present significant problems, and I think that the current government does grasp that at some level. They're kind of waving their hands about capital gains tax, for example, as we're all quite aware of. But I'm just wondering whether you think that in itself, or the kind of cognates of that, would help create a situation where there would have to be some sort of public policy pushback to asset inflation, because it has simply become, it has the potential to become so socially dysfunctional in terms of generational renewal.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if you saw on the online cover of the Sydney Morning Herald, I think this morning, they were talking about some father in Sydney who had 3 children, I think, and he said, it would be terrible if the government abolished negative gearing and capital gains, because then I wouldn't be able to afford these investments by which I'm going to give my children houses. And someone could easily, the same person could easily say, well, if you abolish negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, then the value of housing would plummet, and my 3 children would be able to rent to start off with, would be able to move out of home, and maybe would even be able to buy a house one day. So I actually think that kind of rationale is quite widespread, because if you look at the class of homeowners, people look at homeowners and think, well, there's still a lot of people who own homes, they're obviously older. If they're younger, they're wealthy and have inherited, but there's still a lot of people. So it's hard to see, it will be 10 or 15 years before you get the Labor Party thinking renters are worth doing anything for. But I actually think in that big category, there's a lot of people who only own one home, and I think quite a few of them would prefer that home to deflate dramatically in value so their children could move out. So I do think there are, again, it's a question of strategy and what constituencies are out there. If that argument was made plainly, but somehow it never is. I mean, I just don't get the lack of political communication. I think if the birth rate argument becomes the argument, that's where you're getting close to the kind of J.D. Vance, hard right conservative backlash to neoliberalism. It's like, we need to defend the families, and that's why we need a kind of conservative welfare state again. So it's a pathway, but it's not one that I would like to see pursued too far. But anyway.
Yeah, so with that concludes. Thank you for those excellent questions. I mean, So we hereby declare Counterrevolution launched in Australia. There's a discount code up there, so to satiate your appetite. And for your physical appetite, we have drinks and canapes outside. So thank you very much.